presentation, Lessons I've Learned, Reflections on 37 Years of Parish Ministry. And as some of you know, I didn't start out in life wanting to be a pastor. In fact, it was my first grade Sunday school teacher, Amelia Kuhn, who first suggested that maybe I should think about that because she knew my great-grandfather, who had been a Lutheran pastor in her church for 24 years before he retired, and that was the first person to suggest that when I was in first grade. But I started out with some other ambitions. First, I wanted to be a cowboy. So for the first few years of my life, I thought it would be fun to be a cowboy, but that didn't really pan out because we lived in the city. So then I grew up in Fresno, California, but my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, had a 40-acre vineyard, and from his grapes he made raisins for Sun-Maid for many, many years. He retired at the age of 80. But after I got over wanting to be a cowboy, I went the wrong way here. Let's see. I wanted to be a farmer. We spent a lot of time on the farm, and I loved the farm, and by the time I was 12 or 13, I could drive a tractor, although I don't think I could do that today. But after I gave up on my goal of being a farmer, by the time I was in 5th grade, I really was interested in being a policeman, in law enforcement, and so they had a citywide contest when I was in the 5th grade. And it was what you would do if you were police chief for a day. And I won that contest. And 20 years later, I had Hank Morton, the police chief, sign that when I met him at a political event. But anyway, I had to give up on that goal when I kind of ran afoul of the law. The same day that I was chief of police for a day. So that just did not last very long. But then I learned that there still is a career after you've been in legal trouble. And at that point, I went to college and I was a political science major at Fresno State, California State University, Fresno. And for my last year of college and then 5 years after that, I worked for a congressman from Central California for 6 years. Tony Coelho was his name. He was the first Portuguese American in Congress, and he represented the Central Valley of California. He actually chaired the Dairy and Poultry and Livestock Subcommittee when I worked for him and was on the House Ag Committee. So I still got to use some of my farming skills. But I did that for 6 years and got to meet some interesting people. I did have a little bit more hair there. I had lots of hair until I started in the parish. So. And then I did meet some interesting people. This is a picture of me with First Lady Rosalind Carter. I had to check, that was taken in 1980. And when one of my daughters saw that picture, I showed it to her, I sent it to her on a text after Rosalind Carter died, and she said, "Gosh, Dad, she has the same hairstyle you do." And I looked, and by golly, she does. But she was a very gracious, nice person in that very brief meeting. And then I felt the call to ordain ministry, and I enrolled at Luther Northwestern Seminary in St. Paul. And there's a picture of Bachman Hall, which I lived up there in the 3rd floor of that room right in the center. So, and that's where I met my wife, Ann. And it's something about Ann that she's not here, so I can say this. And I don't know if she'll take credit for it or not, but she does deserve credit for this, because this is something she will be retiring from too. But in our 37 years of marriage, I would say 99% of the sermons I've written, Ann has read for me and made suggestions or proofed them. And I can always tell by the look on her face after she does that whether it needs more work. So I know she is looking forward to retiring from doing that, and she's been very gracious in that. And I think over the years I've become a better writer and sermon giver because of all of Ann's efforts. So she was a communications major in college, so I learned a lot from her. So, and that was a picture at my ordination in July of 1987. So, and we had only been married at that point for I think about 6 or 7 weeks, so she had no idea what she was getting in for at that point. But that was at the reception after my ordination at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Fresno, California. And then a couple weeks after that, I was installed in my first call, which was in Billings, Montana. Any of you from Billings or been to Billings? Yeah. We love Billings. We were there about 4.5 years. It was a great place for a first call. And, if we had family there, we'd probably still be in Montana because we love Montana. And that was at the altar, right, I believe after I was ordained that day, or not ordained, installed that day. So Bishop's assistant turned to me and said he had served there for 5 years, and then he had gone on to become Bishop's assistant and then Bishop. And after he installed me, he turned and he whispered to me after I was installed, he said, Messiah was known as a difficult congregation, and he said, if you can make it here, Brent, you can make it just about anywhere. So, a little bit I know, but anyway, so some of the lessons that I've learned, I did learn at Messiah and Billings. The people there really were wonderful, but so we have 10 commandments, so I came up with 10 lessons that I've learned over the years. So, and I have some stories to go with some of those lessons, but the first lesson that I learned, and I continue to learn this one, is that what we offer as Lutherans, particularly as ELCA Lutherans, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Lutherans, is unique among many Christian denominations, and that is our emphasis on grace. Paul's words that we are saved by grace through faith. I can't tell you for so many people that is not true. They did not grow up in denominations or religions where it was about grace, about God's grace. So often it was about their works, being good enough to be saved. And I think we all fall into that trap at times. And here I think of a woman, the first person that really helped me to see the importance of our emphasis on grace was a dear little elderly woman. She was about 90 years old. She was a pillar in that first call. Her name was Hazel. She was almost 90 years old. And after I had been there for a while, one Sunday she asked me if I would come over for some of her chocolate zucchini cake, which she was a very good baker, and it was the best chocolate cake I've ever had. So, but I went over to Hazel's house, and we sat down and visited for a while, and then she said, Pastor Brent, I've never talked to a pastor about this, and here she is, almost 90 years old, but she said, could I ask you a question? She said, before I was married to my late husband, and I was in my late teens, I had a child, my firstborn, my son. And she said, I didn't marry the father, but I kept my child, and I eventually married my husband, who adopted him, and then we had 3 more sons after that. And she said, what I want to know is, can I still go to heaven? Can I still go to heaven? And all those years as a Lutheran, and all those years living with that, could she go to heaven? And so I told her that absolutely, Hazel, we're saved by grace. You know, if Jesus died on the cross for all of our sins, and there's nothing we have to do to earn it, Hazel. So you were forgiven for all of your sins a long time ago. And she started crying. And then she just said, well, let's have some cake. So we had cake, and then we had communion. And but I learned that day from Hazel, not everybody's always gotten that message, and we as Lutherans have a gift that so many other churches and denominations do not have. It's really about what you can do to be saved. You see that, I don't want to name names, but you can see that in some of our fellow Lutherans. It's always tips back toward wanting to be saved by something we do. And of course, none of us are good enough. But I've learned that lesson over the years from many other people who have asked similar questions in similar ways. But we really have a gift with grace that it's too bad we don't market that better, because everyone needs grace, right? So another lesson that I've learned, which is a similar lesson, is that the church is a hospital for sinners, not a hotel for saints. You've heard me say that once or twice before. And the person that comes to mind with that is I gotta be careful how I say this, but is a woman named Nellie. And I've had a lot of unforgettable characters in my ministry, but in my first call in Billings, the most unforgettable, and probably in all of my ministry, was a woman named Nellie. Nellie and John, I won't say their last names, but they owned the largest Western bar, probably the largest bar in the state of Montana, the Horseshoe Bar and Grill, for many years. And she looked kind of like Lucille Ball. She had flaming red hair. I know it was not natural. And she and John were faithful members of the church, but I don't even know how to say this, but they partied hard. They both used coarse language. Wasn't always comfortable around some of the church folks. They didn't hang around with the best people because of their occupation, being the owners of the Horseshoe Bar and Grill. But they were in church most weeks, even though they shut down that place at 1 or 2 in the morning, most Saturday nights, and sometimes they looked like it. And they had a daughter that had 3 children, and then she got into trouble, and they had adopted all 3 of her children, so they were raising their grandchildren. They were good grandparents, and provided well for those children, and they were in confirmation, and they were in Sunday school, and there were people that kind of looked down their noses at John and Nellie because of what they did for a living. But when Nellie died, it was the largest. Well, one other thing about Nellie that's kind of interesting. She was the Horseshoe Bar and Grill was very popular among a lot of the folks that you'd see on the streets. I was told by my organist, I don't know how she knew this, but she said that when Nellie died, every pimp and every prostitute in the state of Montana was at her funeral. And she said, as well as every law enforcement person that wasn't on duty. So anyway, but Nellie, before I came to Messiah, Nellie had been coaxed by the sheriff's deputies who hung out at the Horseshoe Bar and Grill to run for sheriff against a sheriff who was very unpopular among his deputies. And nobody would run against him, and so they paid her filing fee. And I can't share all of her bumper stickers because some of them are really coarse, but one of her bumper stickers that people still had on their bumpers around Billings when we lived there was "Elect Big Red." And it stood for Billings Interested Grandmother, Retain Educated Deputies. And she had no law enforcement background, except they would often drive she and John home so they wouldn't get in trouble on the way home. But she came within 100 votes of being elected sheriff of Yellowstone County, the largest county in the state of Montana. And Nellie came down with cancer, and when Nellie died, it was the largest funeral, as I said, that I've ever had. There were over 1,000 people there. We knew we couldn't hold it at Messiah because we could seat about 200, 250 tops. So we had it at a large funeral home, and they had it in their largest chapel, but then they opened up the doors to where they would bring in the casket, and there was a big awning outside in a parking lot, and they had I mean, they had 1,000 chairs between the sanctuary, or the chapel, large chapel, and under the awning. They had 3 country western bands that jammed for an hour before her service. And at her service, it was packed full of all kinds of people, some of them in uniform, and they had 3, she only wanted, they played jam for an hour, these great country western bands, but they played 3 songs during the service. First one was I Did It My Way by Frank Sinatra. The second song that they did was a country western song called, some of you may remember this, it's more of a blues song, but Big Mabel Mama. They played Big Mabel Mama, and the third song they played at the end was Amazing Grace. And I've often thought, what an appropriate song for Nellie, because she knew she was saved by grace, even though she was, you know, somebody that a lot of church people would have considered she really shouldn't be in the hotel for saints. But I often think about Nellie, and I have quite a few Nellie stories, because there were a few times where I was called over to their house when they'd have an argument, or different family issues, and but Nellie really was one of the saints, and it was quite the funeral. And I preached on unforgettable Nellie, how she was unforgettable in God's eyes. So let's see. Lesson number 3. This one is community, 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 and this is really one that never really struck me until the pandemic, when we couldn't come together as a community. And I see it now on Sunday morning, because before the pandemic, when we have donuts and coffee down in the Cornerstone room, on a good Sunday, maybe there'd be 40 people down there. We rarely had overflow, and rarely ran out of donuts or coffee. But coming back out of the pandemic, what was one of the things people missed most? Community, right? Being together on Sunday. And so I really learned how important community was during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. And I think going forward for Zion and for any congregation, this is really one of the most important things we can carry with us, that we need to always be looking at ways we can strengthen our community. It's so important that we come together and build relationships. You know, a good part of our congregation, some for health reasons, some because it's convenient, some because they now live far away from Zion, but aren't able to experience community in the same in-person way that we are. And so we continue to have to find ways to build and reach them too, so they feel part of our community. But community, community, community is really one of the lessons that I've learned over 37 years, and I really didn't learn that one really very well until coming out of the pandemic, coming back from the pandemic. This is another one that I've learned over the years. Laughter is important. A healthy congregation can laugh together. And this one I learned fairly early on, probably in my first year at Messiah in Billings. You know, I grew up in the Missouri Synod where laughing was kind of frowned on. Guitars and laughing were not very popular when I was growing up. And but when I first went to Messiah, there had been 2 pastors before me. One lasted 2 years, one lasted 1 year. And the only reason I was called there was because I think they thought a young seminarian was the only one who's going to take this call. And they had been through a really hard time with the one right before me. He'd gone through a messy, sad divorce, and the family came apart, and people chose sides in the congregation, and a lot of them left. And it was just a really, really hard time, like most churches go through at some point. And the first 6-8 months, it seemed like there was this pall over the congregation all the time, no matter what you did. But I'll never forget the Sunday when, and this is going to sound kind of weird, but we had a woman that worked as a nurse for Oliver Peterson, who was a 90-year-old professor from Rocky Mountain College, and she would bring him, I'm sure she was up with him during the night, and then she would bring him to church, and during the sermon she fell asleep. Which isn't a problem in itself, I'm used to that. But she was sitting right in a spot where, and it wasn't the sanctuary wasn't much bigger than this room together, and she started snoring. And she was just getting louder and louder. And I didn't, you're into your sermon, so I didn't realize what was going on until I thought, I've lost my congregation, nobody's listening to me. And then I realized they were chuckling, and then I heard the snoring, and I got the giggles myself, to where I could hardly finish the sermon. And I did get through this sermon, and nobody ever woke her, and they were kind enough to never tell her. But after the service, Bob Roper was his name, and he was a high school band director, and he came up to me, and he was sitting next to her, and I said, Bob, why didn't you nudge her and wake her up? And he said, Pastor, this congregation has needed to laugh together for the last 4 years. And he said, we were laughing together, and we were having a good time. And he said, that is so healing. And he said, and nobody's ever going to tell her what she did. And I don't think they did, because she was back the next week. But anyway, I learned from that experience how important laughter is. And so I think when a congregation can laugh together, whether they're laughing when one of their pastors slips up and makes a mistake like I did this morning when I forgot to invite our at-home audience to take communion, or when we laugh together at a humorous story in the sermon, or whatever it is, laughter is important. Jesus laughed and found humor, and sometimes the Pharisees didn't even realize he was making humor at their expense. But Jesus was very good at that. My favorite picture of Jesus, I was going to put it into my PowerPoint, I forgot, but is the picture of the laughing Jesus. Has anyone ever seen that picture of the laughing Jesus? I just love that picture, and Pat and Kathy Quaid have seen it. So anyway, the laughter is so important for us to be able to laugh together as a congregation. It's a sign of a healthy congregation. So even for Swedes and Norwegians, it's very important. So let's see. Number 5, everyone has something to offer. I could go on and on about this lesson, but I'm just going to tell a few little stories here. I think of, these are from 3 different congregations, these people, but the first one are Herman and Frida Tulp lived kitty corner to my first church, Messiah Lutheran, and they lived in the tiniest little house I've ever been in. That thing was probably 18 by 12 or 15. It was very small. They had 2 little bedrooms, a very small bathroom, a galley kitchen or smaller, and a living room you could put in most people's foyer or entryway, and very small and very, very simple and basic. And the only luxury they had was that Herman had dug out a hand-dug wine cellar outside the house. And he had a couple of rows of vines, and he would always grow grapes. And every year, Monday, Thursday, he would make the wine from his small harvest of grapes, and it was actually pretty good red wine. And everybody looked forward to having Herman Tulp's wine for communion. And they were just saints, both of them. Were very active in the church, and they didn't have a pot to pee in, is how my grandmother used to say it. But I always think of Herman and Frida Tulp, because everybody looked forward to that wine. And actually, we would have kind of a Seder meal, and so people would have more than just a little tiny glass of Herman's wine. They would usually have a serving-sized glass, and everybody looked forward to Herman's red wine. And then I think of Ariana. I don't know her last name, but it's my 3rd call in Chico, California, at Faith Lutheran in Chico. We used to host a rotating homeless shelter. Winters are fairly mild there, but it's still not nice enough for people who live in the streets in the winter. And so the churches would take turns for 3 weeks at a time. They would host adults in the fellowship hall. A lot of them were single individuals. It wasn't like Family Promise, it's just families. And often with homelessness, it's a case of a person who's just mentally ill and not able to function well enough to maintain their own home. And so Ariana had some really serious mental illness and lived on the streets, but I got to know her because she would be one of the crowd that would stay with us for 3 weeks. And one time I went into the sanctuary for some reason, and I heard the most beautiful, we had a nice grand piano like we have here at Zion, and playing the piano. She had no music, she was playing by ear. And she played like Mary Jo. I mean, she was just this incredible pianist, played by ear. And I went up to her and I said, that is some of the most beautiful piano playing I have ever heard, Ariana. And she started crying, and she said, well, is it okay if I continue to play the piano while we're staying here? And she played every day. And so then we invited her to play in church. And she kind of looked like you would expect a homeless person to look, but people wanted her to keep playing because it was so incredibly beautiful. And so she would, anytime they were staying at Faith Lutheran for that 3-week stint, Ariana would play the piano and worship and make everybody cry because she was such a gifted pianist. And I don't know when her life went off the rails, but she could have been a concert pianist. She was so talented. And then Robin Krull, I was trying to find her book because she's written a book, and she dedicated it to the pastors of Good Shepherd when I was there, and I could not find my little copy of her book. But Robin Krull was a young woman who probably 20 years earlier had been a victim of domestic violence. Her ex-boyfriend confronted she and her new fiance in the parking lot of a Walmart not far from the church and shot her in the head and shot him. He died. She survived but had very severe disabilities. It was like she had a bad stroke. She was in the hospital for probably 6 months and then 6 months of rehab. But a few years later, we did a series on forgiveness during Lent, and where we were inviting people to speak. And she came to me and said, do you think I could speak about forgiveness in church? And I was surprised that she asked because speaking was something that was kind of hard for her after her head injury. But I said, sure. And so she spoke. And she got up and she talked about what had happened. And everybody remembered it from the paper because it was one of those instances that everybody saw, even though it was a few years earlier. But then she talked about how she had, in order for her to heal, she had to forgive this ex-boyfriend who had killed her fiance and had wounded her and left her with severe disabilities for the rest of her life. But it was the most moving thing on forgiveness that I've ever heard. And then afterwards, several people told her, you should write a book. And she wrote a book, and her book has been published. But all three of those just remind me that, and I could stand here for hours telling you stories because many of you have stories like this too, but there's no one that doesn't have something to offer to the world and to the church. So let's see here. Number 6. Another lesson I've learned over the years and is reinforced all the time is that people can be incredibly generous. Most people can be incredibly generous. I could stay up here all day telling you stories, but just a few people I think of. I think of Orville Olson in my second call in Dodgeville, Wisconsin. He was a house painter, a Norwegian house painter, still alive, still hear from him once in a while. And we did a big addition in that second call. My last couple of years there, we built a 10,000 square foot building that has offices and a chapel and education and nursery and all that. And well, you've probably been there, huh, Sonia? So when you grew up in Dodgeville. And did you know Orville? Okay. Anyway, Orville, during that project, he came to me and said he was a house painter, painted 5, 6 days a week, very good painter. And he said, it's kind of silly for the church to spend tens of thousands of dollars on painting and staining all the woodwork. It had lots of woodwork. And he said, I would be willing to take 2 or 3 weeks off of work, donate my time, and coordinate all the volunteers who painted and did all that. And he did, and they did a beautiful job, and what a coming together it was. I think we saved like $30,000 on paint and staining and varnishing, but it was worth it to see the people that jumped in and came night after night, day after day, doing painting and staining in the church, coordinated by Orville. My son then was just a little tyke, and he called him Orfo. He couldn't say Orville. And then Woody, I think of Woody Erickson. He was a State Farm agent, and they moved to Dodgeville in the 50s. And Woody became Sunday school superintendent when his kids were little. And when I was there, Woody was in his 70s, and he had been Sunday school superintendent for 50 years. For 50 years. And every Saturday, if I was at church getting ready for the next morning, Woody was there making sure that everything was set up and ready to go. He would have craft projects out and made sure the pencils were sharpened for the teachers and every room was set up just perfectly. Done that for 50 years. And when I left there after 11 years, Woody retired finally, and they had to hire a Christian ed director. Ann had helped Woody kind of as his assistant when she was there, when her kids were little, but I think of Woody. And then I think of Mary Butterfield, one of the saints. She actually was in 2 different congregations that I served. When I served in Dodgeville, she was a member there, and then we moved to California for a few years, and then we moved back to Madison. She was a member of Good Shepherd. Her husband had died, and she had moved to Good Shepherd. But Mary, after her husband died, was very lonely, and she became a full-time volunteer for Mothers of Multiples. She was a retired pediatric nurse. Can you imagine? So she would, every day, 5-6 days a week, she would go and all day help mothers who had twins or triplets. I remember one case, a woman had twins, but she had an older child, James, who had a malignant tumor and needed a lot of care. So in that case, she took care of James so the mother could spend time with the twins. But Mary devoted the last 20 years of her life till she died volunteering for Mothers of Multiples. So it's not just sharing gifts and abilities in the church, but out in the world. And Mary was a great example of that. So those are 6 lessons that I've learned, and I could share many stories from here about people who are incredibly generous, but I'm not going to do that. So, lesson 7, out of adversity often comes growth and good things. And I've learned not to be scared of challenges, but I can think of 2 that are great examples of this. When I served at Good Shepherd in Madison for 12 years, in 2008 we had a record amount of snowfall. We had I think it was 122 inches in Madison, and nobody had suggested we remove any of the snow from the roof. And we had a sanctuary that had laminate wood beams, similar to our sanctuary here, but they didn't have as much of a pitch. It was more of like a 1960s pitch. And so on Ash Wednesday, I looked up at, some of you were there from the call committee, do you remember what it was like? I looked up at the beams one day during the Ash Wednesday service, and I thought, were all those cracks there before today? And I noticed you could see through some of the beams, and every one of these big beams was cracked. And so afterwards, I pulled aside somebody that I knew was an engineer, and I said, have you noticed those? And he said, yeah, I just did notice those. How long have they been like that? And I said, not long. And he said, well, you better call the city and have somebody look at it, because I think they're going to condemn our building. Which is what happened. They were out there that day, they condemned the building, and they told us that we wouldn't be able to worship in it until we repaired it. And that's a whole nother story. It ended up imagining on the property committee for that, Ken. But anyway, it took them more time to figure out how to repair it without taking the entire roof off than it did to repair it. But we were out of there for 6 months. But we had 2 campuses there. And that event really pulled the 2 campuses together with the spirit of unity, because we had to work together, because there, it was a congregation that at one campus worshiped about 850 people, and the other campus was smaller but had more room. So we had to figure out how to encourage people from this one campus, central campus in Madison, to go worship in Verona, because we could, and we also used our fellowship hall, which was a little bit bigger than this, but for worship for those 6 months. But I was just amazed how much it pulled those 2 campuses together. And it was one of those things that was kind of a God thing, and plus insurance paid for it. So it was hundreds of thousands of dollars for the repair after we fought with the insurance company. But so crack laminate beams were my first experience with a major issue like that. And then the pandemic is another good example of all things work together for good for those who love God, because there were some silver linings in the pandemic that were good for the church. One was live streaming and reaching a broader audience. And we have people that watch Zion Faithfully from Seattle and from all over. And it forced us to think outside of the box. So there were some silver linings from the pandemic. I still miss the people that aren't worshiping in person very deeply, but there were some silver linings. And so I've learned that sometimes good things can come out of the darkest times. So, let's see, I'm gonna run out of time here. Number 8, God provides when we can't. This is another example from the pandemic. You know, when we were first shut down at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, it seemed like the sky was falling and the world was coming to an end. And I thought for sure I'd be the last one to turn the lights off. But out of that, you know, the first week we were kind of in shock, but then after that, God provided the right people at the right time in order for us to get through that. And the best example I can think of is, first of all, the live stream. Tim Shea had been working on, where are you, Tim? You're here. Tim Shea had been working on this live stream and had it in place, what, probably 3 years before the pandemic? Tim kept saying, this is cutting edge stuff, we need to be doing this. And we did have a few people watching the live stream, but that was in place, and that was a God thing, that was already in place and ready to go, and we owe a lot to Tim for that. And with the drive-in, I'll never forget where Pastor Mike Rickard said at one of our pastors' meetings, where I was sitting around with masks, or maybe it was on Zoom even then, because I don't think we were back together, but he said, why don't we do a drive-in? Like, well, how would you do a drive-in? He said, well, there's a company in Canada we can order them from, but we better do it now because other churches are going to figure this out in a few weeks, and we're not going to be able to get the equipment. So we ordered it that day and got the equipment that we needed, the transmitter and what do they call that? The low frequency transmitter for a drive-in. And then that was true because we had other churches that tried to get one a few weeks after us, and they had to wait a few months for it. But God provided everything we needed to keep going during that pandemic. I'll get emotional about this one, but Connie can speak to this, how hard it was up until we did the drive-in. And then when we saw your smiles and waves as you drove out of the parking lot, that kind of got us going and got us through it. So anyway, through the pandemic, we really did learn how God provides and continues to provide for us. Number 9, the importance of story. This one I owe a lot to Dr. George Bass, who was my preaching professor at Luther Seminary. It was one of the last years that he taught. And Dr. Bass wrote a book back in the 70s called Telling the Story, which was kind of the best-selling preaching textbook at the time. And he emphasized the importance of using story to share the gospel, using personal stories, people's stories, and he stressed that nobody was more of a storyteller than Jesus when he told the parables, when he talked to his disciples. He was a wonderful storyteller, and Dr. Bass used to say, every person has a story to share, and we need to tune into those stories and share those stories, and that it's one of the most powerful tools we have for sharing our faith in the church and outside the church and in our lives, is to not be afraid to share stories, to tell our stories about our faith and our lives and how our stories intersect with Jesus' stories. So I really owe it to Dr. Bass, because I don't think I would have, if I hadn't had Dr. Bass and learned the value of stories, I would never have lasted 37 years in the parish. I would have gotten bored years ago with my own sermons. So I owe a lot to Dr. Bass. I really do. So, and then this last lesson, I learned this from a few places, but Isaiah 43 verse 1 is one of my favorite verses. I have called you by name, and you are mine. The prophet Isaiah understood the importance of knowing and assuring us that God knows our name. And then, let's see if I can pull this up here. I'm not sure if I can, but yeah, okay. So one of my favorite shows back, you'll recognize this, some of you, I think. Maybe. Well, we don't get good internet reception in here, do we? It's not going to come up. Darn. Okay, well, anybody know the theme song from Cheers? You want to go to a place where everybody knows your name and we're all the same? So, anyway, Cheers. Did somebody sing it? Kelly, will you sing it for us?
Oh, God, help me. We want to, oh gosh. We want to go where everybody knows your name. Yes.
Yes, very good.
And they're always glad you came.
Thank you. And so early on, and I really learned this when I worked in Washington. My boss was wonderful at names. And I swear he could meet somebody once to remember their name. And if he couldn't, he would turn to me and say, "What is their name?" And I knew if I was going to keep that job, I had to learn names as fast as he did. And I learned from him the value because, you know, he had represented a district of 400,000 or 500,000 people and had a lot of friends. And he could remember most of the people he had met and their names and a little bit about them. And so I learned from Tony the value of names. And you know, I am pretty good at names, but sometimes when I blow it big. I had somebody a couple weeks ago after I'd announced my retirement, and he came up to me after church. I don't know if Wes is here. I don't think so. He's a Saturday night person, but he had a name tag and it said Bob. And I said, "Well, Wes, why do you have that name tag on tonight?" And he said, "Well, do you remember when you first came? The first 2 weeks you were here, you called me Bob." So he still remembered that. So, and when we went to Good Shepherd in Madison, which was a much larger congregation than Zion, and I really worked hard to learn names. After I'd been there a few weeks, my daughters were with me. It was probably after the last service, and they were standing next to me, and I said hello to somebody and called them by name, and Terry was her name, and she said, "Oh, I can't believe you remembered my name." And my daughters, who were they would have been, I think, second grade when we first started there, they looked at her and they said, "Yeah, but he doesn't remember our names half the time." Which is true. I get Sarah and Emily to this day, I get them mixed up. I even call Peter by their name sometimes. So my kids will remind me, "You're not as good at names as you think you are." So anyway. But those are 10 of the things that I've learned over the last 37 years that they're not rocket science or anything, but I have maybe 3 minutes for questions. Then I better let the people who need to go to 11 o'clock go. Anybody have any questions? Oh, 10, maybe I didn't. Oh, 10 was names are important. I never switched that. So anyway, Doug. Oh, okay. My internship congregation was on Bainbridge Island in the Seattle area, on Bethany Lutheran Church, which was an old Swedish Lutheran Augustine Synod church, first call. Second call, or that was my internship. First call then was in Billings, Montana, Messiah Lutheran. And then my second call was at Dodgeville, Wisconsin, Grace Lutheran in Dodgeville, which we nicknamed Land's End Lutheran because Land's End is located in Dodgeville. And that was a wonderful boom to the congregation to have a corporate office like that in a small rural town. And then after we left Dodgeville, I took a call to Faith Lutheran in Chico, California, which is north of Sacramento, about an hour and a half north of Sacramento, and we were there only 3 years. It was my shortest call. I followed somebody who'd been there 30-some years, and so I was sort of an unintentional interim. I wasn't planning on moving, but then Good Shepherd contacted me and asked if I would interview at Good Shepherd in Madison, which was about a half an hour from our congregation in Dodgeville, and we were at Good Shepherd for 12 years. So And it'll be 9 years in April that I interviewed with the call committee with Colleen Nelson and several of you that are in here. So it's hard to believe that 9 years has gone by so fast. So, and so that's my call history. So. And I have to say I've learned things in every one, and they've all been wonderful parishes. And you know, you never forget the people, even long after some of them have left this earth. Oh, thank you, Uni. Thank you.